The camera plunges through darkness, through layers of earth and time, before exploding into blinding light. A woman's dirt-stained hands clutch an ancient glowing artifact as thunder crashes overhead. Her eyes, fierce with determination, reflect the lightning as she whispers, "Some treasures are worth dying for, others are worth living for. I found both buried beneath my husband's lies." Zephyra Nightingale had always believed that love could conquer the impossible. At 28, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that poets wrote about, silver blonde hair that caught moonlight like spun starlight, and eyes the color of storm clouds before they break. But beauty, she had learned, was a fragile shield against life's cruelest betrayals. The Nightingale Farm stretched across 200 acres of rolling hills in the forgotten corner of Ravenshollow County, where the mist clung to the valleys like unspoken secrets and ancient. Oak trees stood sentinel over fields that had been cultivated by her family for 5 generations. The farmhouse itself was a Victorian masterpiece, with wraparound porches and gingerbread trim that had once been painted pristine white, but now showed the weathered patina of years spent battling the elements. Each board and beam held memories that stretched back to her great-great-grandmother Evangeline, a woman whose reputation for mystical wisdom had made her both beloved and feared in equal measure throughout the county. The house creaked with history, its floors worn smooth by the footsteps of countless Nightingale women who had walked these halls, each one adding their own layer to the family legacy. For 5 years, Zephyra had shared this sanctuary with Thorn Blackwood, a man whose dark charm had swept her off her feet during a chance encounter at the Harvest Moon Festival. She could still remember that first meeting with crystalline clarity. The way the bonfire light had danced across his angular features, the confident swagger in his walk as he approached her booth where she was selling her grandmother's handmade preserves, the electric shock that had run through her when their hands touched as he reached for a jar of wild blackberry jam. Thorn was the kind of man who could make promises sound like prophecies and lies taste like honey. His obsidian hair and emerald eyes had initially masked a restless spirit that grew increasingly discontent with the simple rhythms of farm life. He possessed an almost magnetic charisma that drew people to him like moths to flame. But Zephyra had eventually learned that charisma without substance was merely performance, and performance could only sustain itself for so long before the mask began to slip. The signs had been there, whispered warnings that Zephyra had chosen to ignore with the willful blindness that love often demands. The way Thorn's gaze would drift toward the horizon during their evening walks, as if he were searching for something she couldn't provide. The increasing frequency of his trips to town that lasted longer than necessary, always with vague explanations about business or meeting with potential buyers for crops they hadn't even planted. The subtle but persistent suggestions that they sell the farm and move somewhere more exciting, somewhere that offered the kind of opportunities that rural life simply couldn't match. His criticism had started small, disguised as helpful suggestions. Why did she insist on doing everything the old-fashioned way when modern farming techniques could triple their yield? Why was she so attached to her grandmother's outdated methods when science had proven better approaches? Why couldn't she see that they were wasting their potential on a patch of land that would never be more than a quaint hobby farm? Each question was a tiny erosion of her confidence, a drop of acid that slowly ate away at her certainty about the path she had chosen. But love, Zephyra had discovered, was often willfully blind to the very truths that could save it. She had convinced herself that his restlessness was temporary, that once they found their rhythm together, once the farm began to prosper under their combined efforts, he would see the beauty in the life they were building. She had believed that love could transform him, that her devotion could fill whatever emptiness drove his constant need for more, for elsewhere, for anything other than what they had. The autumn evening when everything changed began like any other. Zephyra had spent the day harvesting the last of the season's pumpkins, her hands stained orange from the stubborn vines, her back aching from the honest labor she had grown to love. Despite its demands, the October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the trees that lined the property blazed with colors so intense they seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. It was the kind of day that made her grateful for every choice that had led her to this moment, this place, this life. The kitchen, filled with the aroma of her grandmother's famous butternut squash soup, a recipe that had been passed down through generations of Nightingale women like a sacred ritual. Each ingredient had been added with the same careful attention that Celestine had taught her. The sage picked fresh from the herb garden, the cream skimmed from milk provided by their neighbor's cow, the secret blend of spices that no cookbook had ever captured. The process was meditative, a connection to the women who had stirred the same pot, spoken the same quiet blessings over the food that would nourish their families. She had set the table with the good china, the delicate porcelain painted with tiny forget-me-nots that her grandmother had claimed were blessed by fairy folk. The plates had been a wedding gift from Celestine, presented with the solemn admonition that they should only be used for occasions worthy of celebration. Zephyra had decided that the simple act of sharing a meal with the man she loved was celebration enough, that every evening they spent together was a small miracle worthy of acknowledgement. Candles flickered in the gathering dusk, casting dancing shadows across the walls, adorned with family photographs spanning decades. The images told the story of the Nightingale women, Evangeline with her mysterious smile and knowing eyes, great-grandmother Isadora with her fierce determination evident even in sepia tones, grandmother Celestine with her gentle wisdom radiating from every line of her face. Each woman had faced her own challenges, her own heartbreaks, her own moments of doubt, but they had all found ways to not merely survive, but to flourish. Everything was perfect, a tableau of domestic bliss, waiting for the man she loved to complete it. The soup simmered on the stove, its gentle bubbling a counterpoint to the evening sounds drifting through the open windows, the rustle of leaves in the ancient oaks, the distant lowing of cattle from the neighboring ranch, the whisper of wind through the corn stalks in the far field. This was the peace she had always craved, the sense of belonging that came from being exactly where you were meant to be. But Thorn never came home. Instead, Zephyra found the note. It was tucked beneath the salt shaker like an afterthought, written on the back of a hardware store receipt in Thorn's familiar scrawl. Can't pretend anymore. This life is suffocating. Me, the farm is yours, don't look for me, I won't be found. The words were stark, final, without even the courtesy of an explanation or an apology. 27 words that dismantled 5 years of shared dreams and carefully constructed hopes. The words hit her like physical blows, each one stealing her breath until she found herself gasping, clutching the kitchen counter for support. The granite was cold beneath her palms, solid and real in a world that had suddenly become insubstantial. Her legs threatened to give way as the full meaning of the message penetrated the protective shock that had initially numbed her mind. He was gone. Not temporarily, not in anger that could be soothed with time and patience, but permanently, definitively, with the kind of finality that left no room for hope or negotiation. The soup continued to simmer on the stove, its cheerful bubbling a mockery of the silence that now filled every corner of the house. The candles burned down, wax pooling on the careful tablecloth, the romantic dinner becoming a shrine to abandonment. Outside, the wind began to howl through the ancient oak trees that lined the property, their branches scratching against the windows like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way inside, as if the very elements were responding to the devastation that had just unfolded. Zephyra stumbled to the front porch, the note crumpled in her trembling fist, her bare feet finding the familiar boards by muscle memory alone. The evening that had seemed so perfect moments before now felt like a stage set for tragedy, every detail conspiring to emphasize her isolation. Thorne's motorcycle was gone from its usual spot beside the barn, leaving only an oil stain on the gravel like a dark accusation. The sight of that empty space hit her harder than the note itself, because it meant he had planned this, had made his preparations while she was innocently preparing their meal. Her first instinct was to run inside and search for other signs of his departure, to find some evidence that might contradict the brutal simplicity of his message. But she knew what she would find before she looked. His clothes gone from their shared closet, his books vanished from the shelves they had built together, his guitar missing from the corner where it had lived for 5 years. He had been methodical in his exodus, taking everything that mattered to him, and leaving behind nothing but the shell of the life they had constructed. The betrayal wasn't just his leaving, it was the calculated coldness of his departure. No fight, no explanation, no chance for her to understand or change whatever had driven him away. No opportunity to fight for what they had built, to remind him of the promises they had made, to ask him to at least try to work through whatever crisis had pushed him to this decision. Just emptiness where her future used to be, and the crushing realization that while she had been planning their dinner, he had been planning his escape. The first 3 days passed in a haze of disbelief that felt like walking through thick fog, every action requiring conscious effort, every breath a deliberate choice. Zephyra found herself setting 2 places at the table out of habit, cooking enough food for 2 people, listening for the rumble of his motorcycle in the distance. The rituals of their shared life continued automatically, her body refusing to accept what her mind was slowly beginning to understand. She called his cell phone repeatedly until the automated message informed her that the number was no longer in service. Each ring that went unanswered felt like another small death, another confirmation that he had severed every connection that might have allowed her to reach him. She drove to his favorite haunts in town, the pool hall where he played Tuesday night tournaments, the diner where he flirted with waitresses, young enough to be his daughters, the used bookstore where he browsed for hours without buying anything, but no one had seen him, and their carefully neutral expressions told her that they knew more than they were willing to share. Reality began to sink in like poison through her veins, a slow contamination that spread through every aspect of her existence. The farm that had once felt like paradise now seemed like a prison, its isolation no longer a peaceful retreat, but a barrier that separated her from any possibility of human connection. Every room held memories that cut like broken glass, the bed where they had made love and whispered about their future, the kitchen where they had cooked together and planned their days, the porch where they had sat on summer evenings and talked about the children they would raise in this place. The practical realities of her situation began to assert themselves with increasing urgency. The farm was struggling financially, its survival dependent on both their incomes and their combined labor. Thorne had handled most of the equipment maintenance and the heavy physical work, while she had managed the household and the smaller-scale gardening that supplemented their income. Without his contribution, she was facing not just emotional devastation, but economic collapse. Zephyra considered her options with the detached clarity of someone in shock, examining each possibility like a scientist studying specimens under a microscope. She could sell the farm and start over somewhere else. But the thought of losing the last connection to her grandmother felt like another betrayal, another abandonment that would compound the first. She could call her sister, Lorelei, who lived in the city and had never understood Zephira's attachment, to what she dismissively called the middle of nowhere. Lorelei would offer sympathy and practical advice, but her solutions would inevitably involve leaving the farm behind and embracing the kind of urban lifestyle that had never held any appeal. She could simply give up, let the farm fall into disrepair, and fade away like so many abandoned dreams scattered across the rural landscape. The option held a certain seductive appeal in her darkest moments, the thought of surrendering to the overwhelming magnitude of the task ahead. It would be so easy to stop fighting, to let the weeds reclaim the fields and the buildings fall into ruin, to disappear into obscurity and let others deal with the wreckage of her collapsed life. But something deep inside her, some core of strength that she hadn't known existed, whispered a different possibility. What if this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of something she could never have imagined? What if Thorne's departure, devastating as it was, had actually freed her to become someone she had never dared to be, while she was busy trying to be the woman he wanted her to be? The answer came in the form of Serafina Corvell, an elderly woman who appeared at Zephira's door on the fourth morning like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. Serafina was ancient in the way that some people seem to exist outside of time itself, with silver hair that moved like liquid mercury, and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst that life could offer. Her presence was immediately calming, as if she carried with her the peace that comes from having survived every storm and emerged stronger. "I knew your grandmother," Serafina said without preamble, her voice carrying the musical lilt of someone who had spent years telling stories by firelight. "Celestine spoke of you often before she passed. She said you had the gift." Her words were matter of fact, delivered without the careful tiptoeing that most people employed when discussing recent tragedies. There was something refreshing about her directness, a recognition that grief deserved honesty rather than platitudes. "What gift?" Zephira asked, though part of her already knew. There had always been something different about the Nightingale women, a connection to the land that went beyond simple agricultural knowledge. Plants seemed to thrive under their care in ways that defied scientific explanation, and animals were drawn to them with a trust that spoke of some deeper communication. The gift of transformation, of taking something broken and making it whole. Your grandmother had it. Her grandmother before. Her had it. Now it's your turn. Serafina's eyes seemed to look through Zephira rather than at her, as if she were seeing not just the broken woman standing before her, but the person she was capable of becoming. Serafina had lived alone in a cottage at the edge of the Whispering Woods for longer than anyone could remember. Local legend claimed she was a witch, though the more practical-minded folks simply called her an herbalist and healer. She knew the properties of every plant that grew wild in the county, could read weather patterns in the flight of birds, and had a way of appearing exactly when she was needed most. Her arrival at Zephira's door was no coincidence. It was the universe's way of providing exactly the guidance that was required. "I don't know how to do this alone," Zephira confessed, the words tearing from her throat like a physical wound. The admission felt like surrender, but also like the first honest thing she had said since finding Thorne's note. Alone. Serafina's laugh was like wind chimes in a summer breeze, musical and mysterious. "Child, you're standing on 200 acres of the most fertile land in 3 counties, surrounded by the spirits of women who faced far worse than a cowardly man's abandonment. You're not alone. You've never been alone. Her words carried a conviction that penetrated the fog of Zephyr's despair, offering a perspective that transformed isolation into solitude, abandonment into opportunity. Seraphina stayed for tea that afternoon, sharing stories of Celestine's younger days when the farm had been a sanctuary for lost souls and broken hearts. She spoke of the secret garden hidden beyond the orchard, where healing herbs grew wild and untended, their potency enhanced by generations of careful cultivation. She mentioned the old well near the property line that had been sealed for decades, claiming it held more than water, its closure surrounded by mysteries that the county had never bothered to explain. "Your grandmother left you more than land," Seraphina said as she prepared to leave, her parting words carrying the weight of prophecy. "She left you a legacy, but legacies aren't inherited, child, they're earned." The distinction felt important, a reminder that whatever power lay dormant in her bloodline would require her own effort to awaken. That night, Zephyra made her choice. She wouldn't run from the challenge that Thorn's departure had presented. She wouldn't hide from the magnitude of the task ahead. She would stay and fight for the life she wanted to build, with or without Thorn Blackwood, discovering in the process what she was truly capable of achieving when she stopped waiting for someone else to provide her strength. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the first truly beautiful day since Thorn's departure. Zephyra rose before sunrise and walked the entire perimeter of the property, reacquainting herself with every fence post, every boundary marker, every inch of land that was now solely hers to command. The responsibility felt both terrifying and exhilarating, a weight that could either crush her or forge her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. She began with the immediate necessities, the small repairs that had been neglected during the emotional chaos of the previous days. The leaky faucet that had driven her to the edge of madness was fixed with a trip to the hardware store and 30 minutes with a wrench. The broken window in the guest room was replaced with glass that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Each small victory built upon the last, creating momentum that felt almost magical in its power to transform not just her environment, but her sense of possibility. The real work began in the fields, where years of Thorn's increasing disinterest had left the soil depleted and the infrastructure in shambles. The irrigation system was a maze of leaking pipes and broken timers, a patchwork of repairs that had been implemented without any coherent plan. The greenhouse was more holes than glass, its structure compromised by storms that had never been properly addressed. The barn needed a new roof, new doors, and probably new everything else, its decay a testament to the gradual erosion of hope that had preceded Thorn's departure. But Zephyra had inherited more than land from her grandmother. She had inherited stubbornness. Every morning she rose with the sun and worked until her hands bled and her back screamed in protest. She read farming manuals by lamplight, scoured the internet for sustainable agriculture techniques, and slowly began to understand the rhythms of the earth in ways she had never bothered to learn when Thorn was handling the heavy labor. The learning curve was steep and often frustrating. Equipment broke down at crucial moments. Weather patterns seemed designed to thwart her efforts, and her inexperience led to costly mistakes that ate into her dwindling savings. But each failure taught her something valuable, and each small success built her confidence that she could master the skills necessary not just to maintain the farm, but to help it flourish. The work was backbreaking, but it wasn't solitary. Word of Thorn's abandonment had spread through Ravenshollow County with the speed of wildfire, And while some folks whispered behind their hands about that poor girl, others showed up to help in ways both large and small. The community had a way of rallying around people in crisis, offering assistance without making the recipient feel like a charity case. Cassian Stormwood arrived on a Tuesday morning with a truck full of reclaimed lumber and a tool belt that looked like it had seen 1,000 projects. He was a carpenter by trade, with hands that could coax beauty from raw wood and eyes the color of aged whiskey that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. His presence was steady and calming, like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea, and he had a way of making even the most complex repair seem manageable. "Heard you could use some help with that barn roof," he said, his voice carrying the hint of an accent that spoke of mountains and deep forests. There was no pity in his offer, no condescension, just the straightforward assistance of one neighbor to another. His approach to helping was both practical and respectful, acknowledging her capability while offering his expertise where it was needed. Cassian brought more than carpentry skills to the farm. He brought his daughter, Indira, a 9-year-old force of nature with curly red hair and a laugh that could coax flowers to bloom out of season. Indira fell in love with the farm immediately, adopting the chickens as her personal friends and declaring herself the official guardian of the vegetable garden. Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Zephyra of the joy that could be found in simple things when viewed through the eyes of someone experiencing them for the first time. "Daddy says you're going to make this place magic again," Indira announced on her first visit, her small hands already dirty from helping Zephyra plant winter crops. "I think you already have." The child's confidence in her abilities was both humbling and inspiring, a reminder that transformation was often visible to others before it became apparent to the person experiencing it. Other allies emerged from unexpected places throughout the community. Kieran Shadowvale, who ran the local feed store, extended credit without being asked and threw in free delivery for supplies, his quiet support allowing her to stretch her limited resources further than should have been possible. Nix Ravencrest, the librarian, helped Zephyra research heritage seeds and sustainable farming practices, spending hours after closing time diving into agricultural databases and historical records that revealed forgotten techniques. Even gruff old Mordecai Blackthorn, who owned the neighboring cattle ranch and rarely spoke to anyone, showed up one evening to help repair a section of fence that bordered their properties. His assistance was grudging and delivered without explanation, but Zephyra understood that his presence was a form of acceptance, an acknowledgement that she belonged in the community despite the circumstances that had left her alone. But not everyone in Ravenshollow County was supportive of Zephyra's efforts to rebuild. Thorne's departure had left more than emotional wreckage in its wake. It had also left substantial debts that she was only beginning to discover. The feed store bills, the equipment loans, the unpaid taxes, all of it became Zephyra's responsibility, regardless of whether she had known about it or agreed to it. The financial burden was staggering, threatening to crush her efforts before they could gain momentum. The worst of her adversaries proved to be Varian Blackwood, Thorne's older brother and a successful real estate developer who had always resented the fact that his family's good name was associated with what he considered a failing farm operation. Varian had money, influence, and a smile that could charm the devil himself while sliding a knife between your ribs. His contempt for the rural lifestyle was barely concealed beneath a veneer of concern for Zephyra's welfare. "Zephyra, darling," he said during an unexpected visit 6 weeks after Thorne's departure, his tone dripping with false sympathy. I'm here to make you an offer you'd be foolish to refuse. I have buyers lined up who would pay top dollar for this land. Think of it, you could be free of all this struggle, free to start fresh somewhere that actually has a future. His words were carefully chosen to emphasize her isolation and the magnitude of the challenges she faced. His offer was generous enough to clear all the debts and leave her with a substantial sum, but Zephira recognized it for what it was. A gilded cage designed to remove her from the equation so that he could develop the land into luxury housing that would destroy its rural character forever. The development would bring profit to him while obliterating the agricultural heritage that generations of her family had worked to preserve. The farm isn't for sale, she told him firmly, though her voice shook with the effort of maintaining her composure. The words felt like a declaration of war, a line drawn in the sand that would determine the future of everything she held dear. Everything's for sale. Darling, it's just a matter of finding the right price. And when the creditors start calling and the bank starts foreclosure proceedings, you'll discover that sentiment is a luxury you can't afford. His threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and economic pressure. The threat of foreclosure wasn't an empty one. The farm was drowning in debt, and Zephira's savings were rapidly dwindling as she poured every available dollar into essential repairs and improvements. The stress began to take its toll, stealing sleep and appetite until she resembled a ghost haunting her own property. The weight of responsibility was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that failure would mean not just personal defeat, but the loss of her family's legacy. It was during this darkest period that Serafina returned with a piece of family history that changed everything. She arrived on an evening when Zephira was sitting on the porch, staring at a stack of overdue bills and wondering if she had the strength to continue fighting a battle that seemed increasingly hopeless. "Your grandmother never told you about the Nightingale treasure, did she?" Serafina asked, settling into the rocking chair beside her, as if she had been expected. Her timing was perfect, arriving at the moment when despair threatened to overwhelm determination. "What treasure?" Zephira asked, though she was almost afraid to hope that there might be some hidden resource that could solve her financial crisis. "The story goes back 5 generations to your great-great-grandmother, Evangeline Nightingale. She was a woman ahead of her time, a botanist and alchemist who understood the healing properties of plants in ways that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. When the town fathers tried to drive her out for being unnatural, she hid her most precious discoveries somewhere on this property. Serafina's words carried the weight of secret knowledge, of truths that had been carefully guarded for generations. Serafina produced a leather journal from her satchel, its pages yellowed with age and covered in spidery handwriting interspersed with detailed botanical drawings. "Evangeline's journal. Your grandmother entrusted it to me before she died, with instructions to give it to you when you were ready to claim your inheritance." The book felt warm in Zephira's hands, as if it contained not just information, but some form of living energy. The journal was filled with fascinating but seemingly impossible claims. Evangeline had supposedly developed hybrid crops that could grow in any soil, healing tinctures that could cure diseases thought incurable, and most intriguingly, a way to purify and enhance water that would make any land incredibly fertile. The scientific impossibility of the claims was offset by the meticulous detail of the documentation, as if Evangeline had been determined to leave a complete record of her discoveries. "The sealed well," Zephira breathed, remembering Serafina's earlier mention. She hid her work at the sealed well. The pieces were beginning to come together, forming a picture that was both incredible and strangely logical. The Well, that's been sealed for 80 years because the county claimed the water was unfit for consumption, Serafina confirmed, though perhaps too fit for consumption would have been more accurate. Her implication was clear. The well had been sealed not because of contamination, but because of suppression, an attempt to hide knowledge that threatened established interests. The well was located at the far end of the property, hidden in a grove of ancient willow trees whose drooping branches created a natural cathedral. The metal cover was heavily rusted and secured with a chain that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Breaking it open required bolt cutters, borrowed from Cassian and more courage than Zephyrah had known she possessed. Each strike of the metal cutters felt like an act of defiance against the forces that had tried to bury her family's secrets. The first thing that struck her was the sound. Unlike the dead silence of a dry well, this one hummed with the gentle music of flowing water. The second thing was the smell, not the stagnant odor she had expected, but something clean and alive, like rain on summer flowers. The well seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if it had been waiting for her arrival. Using a flashlight and a length of rope, Zephyrah lowered herself into the well. The walls were lined with natural stone, and carved into those stones were symbols that matched the ones in Evangeline's journal. But it was what she found at the bottom that took her breath away and changed everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The water was crystal clear and seemed to glow with its own inner light, creating patterns that shifted and danced, like aurora borealis captured in liquid form. Evangeline's laboratory was still there, preserved in a cave system that opened beyond the well shaft, protected from the elements and from the people who had tried to erase all trace of her work. Glass vessels filled with seeds, dried herbs, and mysterious powders lined stone shelves that had been carved with the same symbols that decorated the well walls. Most amazingly, some of the plants were still growing, sustained by the strange, luminous water that fed the cave system. They seemed to thrive in the underground environment, their colors more vibrant than anything Zephyrah had ever seen growing in natural sunlight. The preservation was so complete that it felt like stepping through time, as if Evangeline had just stepped out for a moment and might return at any second. Zephyrah spent hours exploring the hidden laboratory, cross-referencing Evangeline's notes with the specimens she found. The woman had been a genius, centuries ahead of her time in understanding how to harness the natural properties of plants and minerals to create agricultural miracles. Her work represented a fusion of science and intuition that modern agriculture had abandoned in favor of chemical solutions. The key discovery was Evangeline's water purification system. Using a combination of natural minerals, beneficial bacteria, and what could only be described as alchemy, she had created a water source that could transform any soil into a garden paradise. The process was documented in exhaustive detail, with careful instructions for maintaining the delicate balance of elements that made the transformation possible. The unfit for consumption designation hadn't been about contamination. It had been about suppression of knowledge that threatened established agricultural interests. Evangeline's discoveries could have revolutionized farming, making chemical fertilizers and pesticides obsolete while dramatically increasing crop yields. The decision to seal the well had been an act of economic warfare designed to protect the profits of companies that had built their fortunes on chemical dependency. Armed with Evangeline's secrets, Zephyrah began to transform the farm in ways that seemed impossible to anyone who didn't know the truth behind her success. The first crops grown with water from the enhanced well were not just healthy. They were spectacular. Tomatoes the size of melons, their flavor so intense that customers at the farmer's market lined up to buy them before she could even finish unloading her truck. corn that grew 12 feet tall, its ears so perfectly formed, that agricultural extension agents came to study her techniques. Herbs with potency that surpassed anything available commercially, their healing properties so pronounced that local herbalists began placing special orders. The transformation wasn't limited to the quality of individual plants. It extended to the entire ecosystem of the farm. Beneficial insects returned in numbers that hadn't been seen for decades, creating a natural balance that eliminated the need for pest control. The soil itself began to change, becoming darker and richer with each season, as if the enhanced water was awakening dormant properties that had been sleeping for generations. Word of her extraordinary produce spread quickly through the agricultural community and beyond. The farmers' market stall that had started as a desperate attempt to generate income became a destination for customers who drove from neighboring counties just to purchase her vegetables. Restaurants began placing special orders for her unique varieties, and chefs started creating special menus around the exceptional ingredients she could provide. Agricultural extension agents started showing up to study her techniques, baffled by results that defied conventional explanation. Soil tests revealed mineral compositions that shouldn't have been possible, while plant analysis showed nutritional densities that exceeded anything in the scientific literature. When pressed for explanations, Zephyra spoke vaguely about traditional methods and old family techniques, carefully protecting the secrets that had been hidden for so long. The financial turnaround was dramatic and swift. What had started as a desperate struggle to avoid foreclosure became a thriving business that generated more income than the farm had ever produced under Thorne's management. Zephyra was able to pay off the accumulated debts, invest in modern equipment, and still have enough left over to fund the expansion plans that were taking shape in her mind. But the greatest reward wasn't financial. It was the sense of purpose that had been missing from her life even before Thorne's departure. She wasn't just growing crops. She was nurturing something larger than herself, something that connected her to the generations of women who had worked this land before her. Each morning brought new discoveries, new possibilities, new reasons to believe that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Cassian and Indira had become regular fixtures on the farm, their presence filling spaces that Zephyra hadn't even realized were empty. Cassian's quiet strength complemented her fierce determination, while Indira's unbridled enthusiasm reminded her daily of the magic inherent in watching things grow. Their family unit had formed organically, without drama or desperation, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than need or fear. "You're changing more than the land," Cassian observed one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching Indira chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "You're changing yourself." His words carried both admiration and concern, as if he wanted to ensure that she recognized the magnitude of her transformation. He was right. The woman who'd been broken by abandonment was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more complete than she had ever been before. The transformation wasn't just external, it was cellular, spiritual, fundamental. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, found strength in places she had never thought to look, and learned that the greatest power came not from depending on others, but from developing her own resources. Success brought new challenges and new enemies, as if prosperity itself attracted opposition from those who preferred the status quo. Varian Blackwood's initial attempts at persuasion gave way to more aggressive tactics designed to undermine her success and force her into submission. County inspectors began showing up unannounced, looking for violations that could be used to shut down her operation. Their searches were thorough and hostile, conducted with the obvious hope of finding some technicality that could be exploited. Mysterious problems plagued her equipment with increasing frequency. Pumps that failed overnight despite being recently serviced, vehicles that developed sudden mechanical issues that required expensive repairs, storage facilities that suffered break-ins with nothing stolen but everything disturbed. The harassment was systematic and escalating, designed to create financial pressure and emotional stress that would eventually break her resolve. The attacks became more personal when someone began spreading rumors about her methods and her character. Whispers circulated that her extraordinary results were due to illegal chemical enhancement, that she was deceiving customers about the organic nature of her products, that her success was built on fraud rather than skill. The campaign was sophisticated and sustained, targeting both her customer base and her relationships within the community. The harassment escalated when Zephira announced her plans to establish the Nightingale Institute, a teaching farm and research center dedicated to sustainable agriculture and women's empowerment. The project would bring attention to techniques that certain interests preferred to keep suppressed, while also creating an economic engine that would transform Ravens Hollow County in ways that threatened existing power structures. "You're making powerful enemies," Serafina warned during one of her increasingly frequent visits. "There are forces at work that don't want people to remember what your ancestors knew." Her concern was genuine, born from decades of watching how knowledge could be suppressed when it threatened the wrong interests. The warning proved prophetic. A suspicious fire consumed the old barn just days before its renovation was scheduled to begin, destroying not only the structure, but also thousands of dollars worth of equipment stored inside. The fire department ruled it accidental, but the timing and the precision of the destruction suggested otherwise. The loss was devastating, both financially and emotionally, representing months of planning and preparation reduced to ash. The county suddenly discovered irregularities in Zephira's water rights that threatened to cut off access to the well that had become the foundation of her success. The legal challenge was complex and expensive, requiring lawyers and expert witnesses that stretched her resources thin. The bureaucratic warfare was designed to exhaust her financially and emotionally, forcing her to choose between fighting for her rights and maintaining her operation. Most devastating of all was the attack on her reputation within the community she had worked so hard to rebuild. Anonymous complaints were filed with various regulatory agencies, triggering investigations that were designed to be disruptive regardless of their outcome. The stress of constant scrutiny and the need to document every aspect of her operation began to take its toll, threatening to undermine the very confidence that had made her success possible. The pressure was intense enough to break most people, but Zephira had been tempered by experiences that had already pushed her beyond her previous limits. Every attack only strengthened her resolve to protect what she had built and to honor the legacy she had inherited. She understood now that her battle was part of a larger war that had been going on for generations, a conflict between those who sought to control knowledge and those who believed it should be shared freely. The final confrontation came in the form of an unexpected return. Thorne Blackwood appeared at the farm on a cold November morning, nearly 2 years after his abandonment, looking like a man who had spent those years running from demons that had finally caught up with him. His arrival was unannounced and unwelcome, a ghost from a past that she had worked hard to leave behind. He was thinner than she remembered, his dark hair now streaked with premature grey, his emerald eyes haunted by whatever failures had driven him back to the place he had once rejected. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. replaced by the desperate humility of someone who had learned the difference between want and need the hard way. His clothes were expensive, but rumpled, his appearance that of someone who had been sleeping in his car. "Zephyra," he said, standing at the edge of the porch like a supplicant seeking sanctuary, "I've made terrible mistakes. I thought I needed something different, something bigger. I was wrong about everything." His voice carried a pleading quality that she had never heard before, the sound of someone who had run out of options and was hoping for mercy he hadn't earned. Looking at him, Zephyra felt nothing of the pain she had expected. The woman who had been shattered by his departure no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had discovered her own power, her own worth, her own capacity for creating the life she wanted. The sight of him triggered no revival of old feelings, no temptation to forgive and forget, only a calm assessment of how much she had changed since his departure. "You were wrong," she agreed calmly, her voice steady and clear, "but not about needing something different. You needed to leave so I could find out who I really am." The words were simple but profound, acknowledging both his failure and her transformation without bitterness or recrimination. Thorne's attempt at reconciliation was pathetic in its transparency and desperation. He spoke of love and regret, of lessons learned and changes made, but Zephyra could see through the performance to the calculation beneath. He had heard about her success, seen the newspaper articles about the miracle farm of Ravens Hollow County, and decided that he wanted back into a life he had previously found suffocating. His return wasn't motivated by love, but by opportunity, the recognition that she had become something valuable that he wanted to claim. "I know I hurt you," he continued, his voice taking on the wheedling tone that had once been able to charm her into forgiveness. "But we could start over. We could build something amazing together." The irony of his words wasn't lost on her. She had already built something amazing, something that his presence would only diminish. "We already built something amazing," Zephyra replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to trust her own judgment. "You destroyed it. What I've built since then is mine." The distinction was important, a recognition that the life she had created belonged to her alone, earned through her own effort and sustained by her own strength. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cassian and Indira, returning from a trip to town with supplies for the week's farmers' market. Indira bounded up to Zephyra with her usual enthusiasm, chattering about the seeds she had helped select for next season's specialty crops. Cassian's presence was calm and supportive, his hand briefly touching Zephyra's shoulder in a gesture of quiet solidarity that spoke of deep understanding and shared commitment. Watching the easy intimacy between them, Thorne's expression shifted from desperate hope to bitter resentment. "I see how it is," he said, his voice taking on the nasty edge that Zephyra remembered from their worst fights. "You replace me with the first available carpenter, and suddenly you're too good for the man who helped you buy this place." His words revealed the depth of his misunderstanding, his inability to comprehend that her transformation went far beyond simply finding a new partner. "You didn't help me buy this place," Zephyra corrected firmly, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had learned to stand up for truth. "This farm has been in my family for 5 generations, and I didn't replace you. I simply stopped trying to make you into someone you were never capable of being." The words were harsh but necessary, a final acknowledgement that their relationship had been built on illusions that she was no longer willing to maintain. Thorne left as he had arrived, alone and angry, but this time his departure felt like a liberation rather than a loss. Watching his car disappear down the gravel drive, Zephyra felt the last chains of her old life falling away. His return had served an important purpose, allowing her to measure how far she had traveled and confirming that she had no desire to return to the person she had been when they were together. The Nightingale Institute opened the following spring with a celebration that drew visitors from across the region and beyond. The renovated facilities included a teaching greenhouse where students could learn hands-on sustainable farming techniques, demonstration gardens that showcased heritage varieties and innovative growing methods, a modern processing facility for value-added products, and dormitory-style housing for women participating in the residential program. The Institute's mission was simple but revolutionary: to provide women with the knowledge, skills, and confidence needed to transform their lives through connection to the land. Students learned everything from basic gardening to advanced permaculture, from business planning to personal empowerment. Many were women fleeing abusive relationships, starting over after divorce, or simply seeking a different way of living in harmony with the natural world. Evangeline's discoveries, updated with modern scientific understanding, became the foundation for research that attracted attention from agricultural universities and sustainability advocates worldwide. The water enhancement techniques were studied, replicated, and shared freely, spreading the knowledge that had been suppressed for generations. Academic papers were published, conferences were organized, and a new generation of farmers began implementing techniques that promised to revolutionize sustainable agriculture. But perhaps the most important transformation was in Zephira herself. The frightened, abandoned woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from clinging to what others gave you, but from cultivating what already existed within yourself. She had learned that abandonment could be a gift. When it forced you to discover your own capabilities, that betrayal could be a teacher when it showed you what you were truly capable of surviving and overcoming. Her relationship with Cassian had developed naturally, without drama or desperation, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than need or fear. When they married in a simple ceremony in the grove where Evangeline's well was located, it felt like a celebration of partnership rather than a surrender of independence. Their union was based on strength rather than weakness, on choice rather than necessity, on love that enhanced rather than diminished their individual capabilities. Indira, now officially her stepdaughter, had grown into a confident young woman who spoke of someday expanding the Institute's reach to help women around the whole world. She carried herself with the same quiet strength that had always defined the Nightingale women, proof that the legacy would continue into future generations. Her presence was a daily reminder that transformation was not just personal, but generational, that the work of healing and empowerment would continue long after Zephira herself was gone. Standing on the front porch of the farmhouse on the eve of the Institute's second anniversary, Zephira reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The land stretched out before her in all directions, no longer the prison it had seemed in those dark days after Thorn's departure, but a kingdom she had claimed through courage, intelligence, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. Every field, every building, every path bore the mark of her determination and the legacy of the women who had come before her. Serafina had been right about the gift. It wasn't the ability to grow exceptional crops or to purify water or even to heal broken hearts. The real gift was transformation itself, the power to take something broken and make it whole, to find treasure buried beneath the ruins of abandoned dreams, to discover that the greatest magic wasn't in what others could give you, but in what you could become when you stopped waiting for permission to claim your own life. The Nightingale Institute had become more than a teaching farm. It had become a living testament to the truth that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Every woman who walked through its gates carrying the weight of a shattered life would leave with something far more valuable than agricultural knowledge. They would leave with the understanding that they possessed within themselves everything needed to write their own comeback story, to transform their pain into power, their abandonment into independence, their brokenness into strength. As the sun set over the hills of Ravenshollow County, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zephyr smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the generations of women who had prepared the way for this moment. The farm would continue to flourish. The Institute would expand its reach, and somewhere in the world, another woman would discover that abandonment was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her power. The cycle would continue, each generation building on the strength of the last, each woman finding her own way to transform suffering into triumph, loss into discovery, endings into beginnings.